few faces I recognize, so some of you will know me. Yes, I've been working for Carers Link for 12 years now. I used to be an occupational therapist with Greater Glasgow Health Board, and then I retired and Julie took up a different job. That wasn't quite what I'd planned at the time, but loved doing it. So I deliver training and I deliver one-to-one support sessions for clients registered with Carers Link. But I'm going to chat today. I was asked by June to talk about demand avoidance, which is a big issue, I know, across the whole neurodivergent population. And my question about demand avoidance is this a challenging behavior or is it survival instinct? Those of us with the neurodivergence, I am not autistic, I'm ADHD, and sensory processing and all sorts of other things. But for those of us who are neurodivergent, we have hypersensitive autonomic systems. Our autonomic system is our fight, flight, freeze, protection response. And that is traditionally higher in individuals who are neurodivergent, across the spectrum of neurodivergence, particularly the top three: autistic spectrum, attention deficit, and dyspraxias. We tend to have a system which responds with fear. Now, PDA, pathological demand avoidance, is a perfect example of that. The word pathological means that it's a chemical response. So what a PDA individual is experiencing is an autonomic system which is constantly in fight and flight response. The hormonal and chemical responses of their body makes everything feel a threat to them. So when we are threatened, our natural response is to avoid. There's nothing unusual or bizarre about that. That's what human beings do. That's why we survived. That's why we're still on the planet. So we need to protect ourselves. So how do we help individuals who have issues with demand avoidance? Well, the obvious thing is, why? They're not trying to be a nuisance. They're not trying to be awkward. They are avoiding something because they anticipate that that is going to cause them pain. So that could be some form of avoidance behavior in the sense of, I'm going to stamp my foot and refuse. It could be that they storm out the room and refuse to do something. It could be that they simply go off but don't do it. You know, the bedroom is still untidied 20 minutes later. Or as we get into adulthood, we do a lot more subtle things like we procrastinate. You know, procrastination is a common issue. Impulsive behavior actually has exactly the same reason as procrastination. I'm going to go off on that tangent because then I don't have to think about this instead, and I don't want to go there. So these avoidance behaviors are because of that sense of dread and pain. So I'm going to avoid doing it. Now, we avoid doing things because we consider them to be dangerous. So if we don't consider them to be dangerous, we're less likely to avoid them. Pretty obvious. So one of the big things is if you are trying to get somebody else to do something for you, you know, the famous get your room tidied, get ready for school, get whatever, then the important thing is that that person feels that they know exactly what's going to happen and that they feel competent to control that situation. Now, When I do the SAND training, we do a basic training block called SAND, Supporting Autism and Neurodiversity. And in the second session, third session on the videos of it, I look at the 3 processes of autism and neurodiversity. The theory of mind, understanding sort of the viewpoint of other individuals, why are those rules there, those type of things. Central coherence, which is all about understanding what is happening, why is it happening, what impact does that have on me, and what is expected of me, and the executive skill itself of being able to then plan, organize, implement, assess, change, etc. Problem solving, and all that comes into executive skills. Now, those 3 things, particularly the central coherence and executive skills, are a lot of the big fears for those of us on the neurodivergent family. If you are not sure what is happening and why, then how can you prepare to deal with it? And the devil is in the detail. I talk about structure. And structure isn't about timetables. It isn't about, at 4 o'clock on a Wednesday, we do this. Or we're doing this, followed by this, followed by this, followed by this. Timetables are useful, very useful, but they don't have the detail. The detail for us to be able to understand what's happening and how do I manage that situation. I need to know what is about to happen. Where is it going to happen? Who's going to be involved? And how long is that going to take? So the what, where, whom, and time is important if you're asking somebody to do something, because otherwise they're not sure where they're, and why. I mean, the why am I supposed to be doing this? And that's an issue for ASD, but it's a huge issue for ADHD because we are very volitional orientated. So if you have somebody with a dual diagnosis, then that, I don't understand the purpose of this. This doesn't make any sense to me. This doesn't have any relevance to me, but you want me to do it anyway. Well, that's not happening. So they back off. So it's a matter of feeling confident about knowing what is about to happen, and therefore you can start planning. Because the analysis of what needs to be done and how you're going to manage the possible pitfalls of that depend on you knowing what's happening and being able to make not only a suitable plan, but a potential 3 other plans if it goes wrong. Because we're not good at instantaneous problem solving. That's not part of our skills. So if we don't feel confident to do that, we're not even going to try. We're going to avoid it like the plague. So if you're trying to get somebody else to do something for you, they need to understand why, what, where, for how long, with whom, before they get started. And they may need additional support with, well, how do I actually plan and sequence and organize that? And how long have I got? It's a bit of a myth, actually, that neurodivergent individuals are bad at planning and organizing, because we're not. We're extremely good at it. The difference is that we need to have all of the information and enough time to then process it all. And that's not a common thing in this day and age. It's, well, here's what we think is important, and we need you to do this in the next 10 minutes. And that isn't enough time to do all that analysis and planning and organizing. So You know, you're trying to go into something with half the information and a quarter of the strategies. That would sound rather scary, doesn't it? For most of you, you would find that situation scary. So, obviously, what's the best solution? Just avoid doing it, okay? So, from an adult perspective, if we're trying to do something for ourselves, and you find that you're constantly putting it off and putting it off, and you're procrastinating about it, the thing is to work out why. Why is this thing such an issue that I've actually put it on my to-do list 3 times and it's still not done? Yeah, welcome to my world. I have to-do lists that kind of have things that jump from day to day to-dos and never get done. By the time it gets to sort of 3 rewrites, I realize that there's something going on that's stopping me from doing it. So one of the really good skills to learn or to teach to our kind of early teens and onwards is risk assessment tools. So if you get a risk assessment table and say, what is the consequence of this? Minor, going up, you know, moderate, high, catastrophic. And what is the likelihood of it happening? You know, predictable, possible, likely, inevitable. And then work out, where do I put that? Where would I put this issue? And then, like any other risk assessment table, you say to yourself, well, how do I move that down the scale? So if you learn to risk assess your own life, and you learn to risk assess what can I do to actually reduce the risk, then you can reduce the fear. I've done a lot of this through my lifetime. I've done a lot of it for my 3 neurodiverse sons, but I've done a lot of it for myself. So you learn to actually reduce your fear of the item because you've logically planned out, where is the barrier and how do I overcome that barrier? So if you're teaching somebody else, it's about making sure that they are comfortable and confident with the knowledge of what has to be done. And if you're working for yourself, you have to identify what is that fear and how do you get a logical, I mean, you may end up with a response that actually, there's no way of reducing this. This is an absolute horrible train crash in the making. And maybe it's a good idea to avoid it. You know? So maybe our brain was telling us that we should avoid it before our logical thinking was. So sometimes you don't do it because you think, actually, that's not a good idea. That's why my body's telling me, my brain is telling me, don't go there. So what do we do when we're ending up with somebody who's constantly in this level of fear and anxiety? Because avoidance is all about fear. So if we can reduce the fear, can we reduce the avoidance? Now, I spend a lot of time talking about behaviors being about our autonomic system and our arousal system. And a lot of what other people consider to be negative behaviors are actually about our arousal responding to that situation. And over on the Carers Link table is one of my arousal thermometer sheets. I've got about 30 of them there, so I haven't counted the numbers tonight. But I spend a lot of time talking about the arousal thermometer, which is what our autonomic system does. All human beings have an autonomic system, and they all have a thermometer. And blue is that switched off level, that it could be physically switched off. You could be asleep, or you could be feeling sluggish. I'm not a morning person. I definitely start in blue. Some people are like that at the end of the night. Some people are like that at both ends because you're so exhausted. But blue is not about, these are not about emotions. These are about how your body is physically responding. So you would also probably be in a blue phase when you were not feeling well, or it was too hot or stuffy or whatever, and your body feels leaden. Most of us move out of that and into the green. And the green is the just right alert level. That's where we all actually want to be. This is us in our safe place. This is us functioning effectively. This is us being focused and understanding what's happening and being in control of the situation. And then we move from there into the yellow. And yellow, low yellow isn't really an issue. Low yellow is when there's quite a high demand and you're having to put in extra effort. Now, some of us work really well in that level because, you know, that focus gets you going. But if you stay in that for too long, you start to get stressed and overloaded, physically and mentally. And if people just keep adding more little things on top of that, you start to climb up the yellow until you get to the top of the yellow. And at the top of the yellow, you feel like you're juggling everything. And then a little voice inside your brain says, I can't do this. I'm not in control. And as soon as that happens, you fall over into the amber, and out comes that autonomic survival system of, if I'm not in control, I'm not safe. So the fight, flight, freeze response comes into play. Now, people think of fight, flight, and freeze as either freezing on the spot or curling up like a hedgehog, or running away, which is flight, or fighting people. But it's not that simple. Freeze is really about disappearing. It's the, I'm just going to avoid doing that, and I'm not, you know, if I'm just blend into the background, nobody will know I'm here, the demand will go away, and I'll be fine. It could be that curl up like a hedgehog thing. In adults, what you tend to see is people simply shutting down. You know, they kind of slowly but surely fold inwards. And the head goes down. So, freeze is about trying to simply vanish. If I'm not here, it can't hurt me. Flight is about avoidance. Flight is about, I'm getting out of this situation somehow. So that could be about having a tantrum, because then I don't have to do it. It could be about distraction. It could be about simply avoiding in any other way. My middle son was extremely good at being the class clown, because that way everybody loved him, but he didn't have to actually achieve anything. Demand wasn't made of him. So, very popular with the other pupils, not very popular with the teachers. But, you know, it was a good avoidance strategy. And fight is not necessarily about aggression. Fight is about dominance. It's about control. It's about being in charge of the situation. So it could be about manipulation. You might manipulate other people. You might manipulate the environment. You may be actively controlling in the sense of, you know, sort of physically controlling the environment, but not necessarily. So that fight, flight, freeze comes into play as soon as you go into the amber, as soon as you go into the, I'm not actually in control here. Your body will start to try to make that situation controllable and safe. And some of our individuals, not as many as people believe, will go straight over into the red. And the red, which is total shutdown, doesn't look like any of that defiant behavior at all. Red is literally, it almost looks like freeze, because you start focusing entirely inward and you don't focus on the outside environment. You're not trying to adjust the outside environment. You're trying to keep your body going. So that's not when people fight or shout or swear or do whatever. We talk a lot about this in session 4 of the SAND training. But avoidance is definitely coming in that high yellow or low amber. So we need to think about how do we help our individuals or ourselves read where are we on that thermometer. And again, I spent a lot of time in the training sessions about how do we do that? How do we identify where that arousal is, and am I in that autonomic storm? Am I in that situation where I'm about to trip over the edge? Because once we're in that amber phase, it's extremely difficult to get out of it without the assistance of somebody who knows, understands us, and helps us. But we can regulate these systems by using sensory approaches. I went and did sensory processing training many years ago and was duly diagnosed as sensory processing disorder, as is my oldest son. 97% of spectrum have a sensory processing issue. And it's not necessarily about being sensitive to light or sound. There's an awful lot more. There's 8 senses in total. But being able to control our sensory system, our arousal system, depends on our sensory system control. Because when we are highly aroused, our sensory systems are much more acute. So actually, it's much more difficult to shut out the outside environment when you are potentially in danger. So our sensory system depends on our arousal, and our arousal depends on our sensory system. So we can use our sensory system to control our arousal. So activities which have a lot of movement or pressure or stretch, things like yoga or stretches or weightlifting or any of these activities which provide a lot of weight and stretch, will release endorphins into our brains, which actually calm us. So one of my strategies when I start to get stressed is to go and do wall press-ups. And if they aren't working, if you ever come round a corner and sort of find me doing squats, I suggest you turn around and go back the other way, because I'm madly trying to regulate and I'm not a good person to be around at that moment in time. So teaching our individuals or ourselves pressure activities which can help us to calm is extremely useful. We can either do that in regular bites through the day and build up what we call a sensory diet, where you regularly do these little top-ups to feed your system. So if you're in an environment that you know is going to be stressful for you, can you find 1 minute or 2 minute slots to just go and do these things? So I basically got through secondary school by visiting the girls' toilets roughly every second period, and doing about 10 press-ups against the cubicle wall and then heading to the next classroom. I had a very bizarre teenage years. So you can build it up through the day instead of allowing it to actually get to explosion stage, or when you feel that you're getting to that stage, you can implement that as part of your routine. And it's really important for those of you who have school-age children to point out to the schools that this has to be part of the support plan for those of us who are neurodivergent. We have to have brain breaks and movement breaks as part of our day. These are not treats. These are not, oh, well, they can play on their phone for 5 minutes if they've been good. We need that regulation, because if we don't feed ourselves, our arousal rate is going to be deregulated. And that's when this avoidance behavior and outburst behavior is going to occur. So, if we can keep our regulation right, and we can make sure that the person feels safe and confident doing the things we are asking of them, it is less likely, I'm not saying it's not possible, but it's a lot less likely that you will get so much avoidance behavior. They're not trying to be awkward. They're trying to survive. So if we give them the tools, if we give an environment which gives the tools they need, and we give them the self-awareness and strategies to regulate themselves, a lot of that avoidance will stop. I've raised 3 neurodivergent sons. I now have a 42 and twin 40-year-olds who know how to regulate themselves. I'm not saying we don't get avoidance behavior, particularly from the middle one. I wonder why the spectrum presentation. But it's nowhere near what it was back in the early days. So they use risk assessment tools, and they use self-regulating stuff. And it helps. I use them all the time, and they help. And when I don't use them, things go wrong. So you need to think about, how do we build a world which makes sense, and how do we help them to regulate themselves within that world? And then there's no need for the fear. Does that make sense? Yeah? There's copies of this over on the Carers Link table. And if any of you want to do any of this stuff in more detail, we run the SAND sessions. The next SAND session will be starting at the end of October, just after the October break, the school holidays. It runs as 4 sessions, 4 3-hour sessions, and we do it face-to-face and on Zoom simultaneously. So if face-to-face doesn't work for you, then Zoom will work. We're doing a daytime one on the next block. It'll be on a Friday mornings in Edinburgh, and it'll be Zoomed out. So that will be 10 till 1 in the morning. The next block, which will probably be into the new year, will probably be an evening block. So if that's more suited. The trouble is, evening blocks are good for working folk, but they're between 7 and 10, which is right over bedtime. So the trouble is, if we start any earlier, people aren't home, and if we start any later, people are falling asleep. And I noticed that although the cameras are all off, when I log off, half the people don't, because they've probably fallen asleep. But if you want any further information, I'll be over at the Carers Link table. We do also run a session with Carers Link, though we haven't booked one in yet for this term. We do a one-off session called arousal, sensory, and self-regulation. That's not Zoomed out, it's a face-to-face session, and I bring all the equipment to teach what sort of equipment and methods you can use for brain breaks and movement breaks for yourself or your young people. And the next one we're hoping to do on a Saturday, because we've always done them on weekdays. So we're trying to find a venue, and we'll do it on a Saturday. So keep in touch with Carers Link if you think that would be an interesting session for you. Okay.